Hello.
Hi.
Are you gonna cough?
No.
Okay. This is Take Your Medicine. I'm Jacob.
And I'm Sadie.
And yeah, we got a lot to talk about as usual. So we're gonna start running our mouths right now.
Okay.
So the first thing I want to talk about is don't have a story for this, but talking about gun rights because we had this shooting in what's it called, Uvalde?
Yeah.
Which is like the most interesting town name in all of the United States, probably. It's like the most out of place one I've ever heard.
Well, it's either like a Pueblo American name or it's a Mexican word. I'm not sure what the origin is, but it would make sense that that would be in Texas if anywhere.
It's a cool name.
Or New Mexico or something
but,
like that. But
obviously there was a terrible school shooting that happened there.
Yes.
We're not going to talk about the school shooting. What I want to talk about more is gun rights and getting into some of the historical background to gun rights, but also just, trying to reason about why we accept the risks of people, including children, dying for the sake of people owning firearms, right?
Right.
Because I think, freedom itself is dangerous. It's risky. The more freedom you have, the more freedom you have to hurt yourself or other people. That's just how it works. It's a double-edged sword. The more freedom you have, the more free you are to make your life absolutely wonderful. And the more free you are to make your life and the lives of others absolutely terrible. The thing is, we value rights to the extent that we say, yes, the risks of bad things happening are worth the benefits that we get from it. And those benefits can be philosophical. They don't have to be strictly utilitarian, right? So the idea that, the Second Amendment is to protect against tyranny is more of it's a philosophical statement. No one actually expects, even on the right, to have to use guns directly against the government. But by the nature of the citizenry being armed, the government is naturally going to have pause when it tries to do something, when it tries to step over the line, or when it's thinking about overstepping the line. It has that roadblock of, but wait a minute, there's 100 million plus people armed in this nation. So do we really want to do this,
Right.
So you have anything to say at that right now?
Well, when you were saying that, you take a risk when you have freedoms, I think we've talked about this before, but that was the entire point of Puritans settling this land to begin with, and then why 200 plus years ago we became our own nation and fought in the Revolutionary War. It was because we were taking a risk, and we knew we were taking a risk, but we weighed the consequences of those actions, and the outcome was going to be better than the present situation. And the solution to get to that outcome was a risk, but not all of the men in our nation, but the young risk takers of our nation who became our founding fathers believed in it enough to take that risk. So that same principle obviously is going to apply when they are writing the Constitution and writing those first few amendments that they made to the Constitution, because they wanted to uphold that same risk-taking mentality, but also that freedom-seeking mentality. Yeah. It's just, that's where the scrappiness of Americans comes from. That's where the very independent nature comes from. And that's where the individualism of our nation comes from, even though we are not necessarily an individualistic society. And
I'm glad that you brought up the history referencing the Puritans, because I think what's lacking in historical or history education, particularly before college, is that teachers don't, and the curriculum doesn't really do a good job of forcing you to think about what you'd be doing in that situation. Put yourself in that time.
Right.
And imagine you knew the people that went to the New World, or imagine you were one of the people. But really imagine yourself in that situation. Would you be the one crazy enough to go to an unsettled land after months of traversing across the ocean, going to where you know nobody, where there's no infrastructure, you have to build everything yourself, and the risk of disease and starvation is extremely high? Would you do that? I wouldn't. I know.
Well, the Puritans felt they had no other option.
Right, but that's what I'm saying. I guess empathy is the right word. Think about what like these people are often derided as like backwards because they, you know, had racial insensitivity, but that was just emblematic of the time.
Right.
But no one recognizes how unique these people were in the fact that they were taking these enormous risks to go and do something, and they didn't even know if it was going to pan out the way they wanted.
Right.
They just wanted the freedom to do what they were going to worship as they please. And they took that huge risk to do that.
Well, and can you imagine if you're still living in England when the Puritans left? Imagine how salacious that would have been if you had known someone who was like, I'm getting on a boat in 3 or 4 months, I might hit land. Who knows? You'd be like, wow, can you believe the Millers down the street are leaving?
All right.
That is unheard of. And that is improper. And it, you know, that's just not English culture. You're not supposed to go against the flow.
Right.
But that exact mentality is what our American culture is. And that's why anyone can come to America and become American. Because if you are a free thinker and you want to express your beliefs in any way that you want, that's why you come to America.
Yeah.
So it doesn't take much to be an American culturally, I don't think.
Yes. And then thinking about the revolution that you mentioned, like trying to put that same frame around like the founders. Like the founders were radicals. They were literally revolutionaries. They were radicals. They were going so far like in the left field with their ideas that they were promulgating. Like we take for granted, oh yeah, you know, modern democracy where there's representation in the government and, you know, you have a generally free society. Like we take that for granted as if that's the default state of being, but there were no democracies in the world at the time that the United States was founded. None. These guys were saying, we don't want a monarchy. Literally every place is a monarchy. They were like, we're going to get rid of that. We're going to invent a totally new system of government that's designed to protect, and we're going to introduce this idea of self-evident natural rights. We're going to use that as a bedrock for our That's radical. That's like somebody coming up with a brand new government system and then saying, yep, we're going to fight the world's greatest empire, lose tons of lives, risk the ire of the monarch of the world's greatest empire, and we're going to institute a new government that hasn't been seen before.
Right.
Do people properly like internalize how absolutely radical that is? That's like...
Well, and imagine if they hadn't won. You'd be like, wow, there was a crazy small group of people who thought they could upend the monarchy of Great Britain, even though they were, you know, the Great Britain and the king was responsible for the colonies. They thought they could just dethrone him and they could have their own country. If they had lost, you'd be like, wow, those people were out of their minds. And we'd still be living under the crown. Right. Even though in England there's the parliament now, you'd still be under the sovereignty of the queen.
Yeah. And these
it's so
guys,
weird to think about.
And these guys too, they were literal insurgents. Yeah. Like they were blending in among the civilian population, and then when they wanted to fight, they grabbed their muskets because they were farmers and they shot British.
Well, and they had to, any pamphlets that they published about their ideas, they either had to write under a pseudonym or write under the guise of anonymity. And they had to make sure that they trusted their printing press operator to not out them to everyone in the village. And it was like, who's spreading this filth and this? I mean, the majority of people who are in the colonies did really did not want to anger the crown, because if they had failed again, the entirety of the colonies would have suffered consequences, not just the few radicals. Because as far as the crown knows, everyone's in on it that is living in the New World. So it's crazy to think about what would have happened if they had lost, and what the Americas would look like right now if that had never happened.
Yeah, but it did, and now we have natural rights that are protected by the Constitution. That's the other idea that I think people on the right understand, but people on the left don't, is that the Constitution doesn't grant rights, it protects them. The rights are natural and inherent, and to the extent that the government starts trampling over those rights, the government becomes illegitimate. So if the government is no longer fulfilling its purpose of protecting your natural rights, then it's an illegitimate government. That's that's the bedrock philosophy. So it doesn't matter what laws the federal government passes. If the federal government passes a law, let's say forcibly quarantining people, it becomes illegitimate at that point. It is not worthy of being served, or we're not supposed to serve the government, but it's not worthy of being obeyed. It's not worthy of being, given taxes, whatever. It's worthy of being dismantled. That's about it when it gets to that point. Right. But that's the culture. So when these radicals said we want this freedom and we want the freedom that's inherent to every individual to be recognized in law, then we, of course, have the right, the Second Amendment, right to free speech, freedom of religion, right to be not a victim of unreasonable searches and seizures, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So with all that context said, so that this text of the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So everyone knows that. But I thought this conversation would be interesting. So there was a man by the name of Sir William Blackstone who did a lot of thinking about natural rights. Mm-hmm. And he described the right to bear arms as an auxiliary right, meaning that the right to self-defense is inherent and natural, meaning that any person who fears for their life is going to use self-defense and potential lethality to prevent their life from being lost. That's just an innermost desire of every person that's being aggressed against, right? It's self-defense, first and foremost. So that's inherent and natural. It's self-evidently true. You don't need to prove it. It's just everyone feels that way. But the right to bear arms is not obviously inherent. It's not obvious that while you have the right to self-defense, it's not obvious that you should be able to own the tools that enable the self-defense. But that's exactly Sir William Blackstone's point, is that it's an auxiliary right, meaning that it enables the execution of the natural right.
Right.
So, we talk about self-defense. You can think about a small woman and a large man. If the large man aggresses against the woman, you could say, well, technically she has the right to self-defense, but if she's unsuccessful because of her physique, that's just unfortunate, which obviously is not right, right? If you have the right to self-defense, you should be able to execute on that right. You should be able to exercise that right. Because it's one thing to say you have a right, but if you can't exercise it, then what's the point, right? And so he says the right to bear arms is an auxiliary right because it enables the exercise of the right of self-defense that's inherent and natural.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting framing that probably left-wingers don't think about. They don't see why a gun needs to be a right, why lethal weaponry needs to be a right, but when you frame it as an enablement of the right of self-defense, it makes a lot more sense.
But if Democrats and leftists are trying to make this argument that the right to self-defense doesn't inherently give you the right to own the tools for self-defense, that just seems like a very weak argument.
Yeah.
For the reasons that you just said. And it's like you're splitting hairs if that's the argument you're trying to make. Like, yeah, of course you can defend yourself, but you shouldn't be able to carry a gun to defend yourself.
Right.
And you see this in New York. You're not allowed to carry pepper spray, a knife, a gun. You're not even allowed to wear body armor or own body armor in New York City. Mm-hmm. So you have the right to self-defense, except we're going to make sure that you're completely defenseless unless you are big enough and strong enough for hand-to-hand combat. But also, hand-to-hand combat doesn't do you any good when you're killed by an illegal weapon.
Right.
So that really is an argument that splits hairs. But the leftists, they will tie themselves in knots just trying to come up with a reason and a rationale that backs up their position, so it doesn't have to be coherent or cogent at all.
Right. Well, they do this with all kinds of rights. Like they say, well, of course we love free speech, but, social media companies should control misinformation. It's like, well, you're doing the same thing. You're saying, well, of course you have the right to speak freely, but, we're going to remove the tools by which you can promulgate your ideas. It's like, well, then if I just have to be silent in my home with no one hearing me, then what's the point of right to free speech?
Right.
I'm not going to talk to myself. I don't need the right of free speech to be able to think my own thoughts.
Well, and the other problem, too, is that these inherent rights that are bestowed on us by our creator are not meant to have caveats. They just are. Mm-hmm. So if you're saying, of course, I believe in free speech, but your argument is already nullified because you've already stepped across the line that is your natural given rights, your birth rights, basically. So if you're trying to caveat it at all, your argument is kaput. Right. I mean, it's not a valid argument. Mm-hmm. Once you try to make any caveat in which you cannot amend the Constitution itself, it's a pointless argument.
I'm glad you brought up the point of caveats, because that makes me think along this line of the Second Amendment. Tim Pool says all the time, I think private citizens, by the letter of the Constitution, should be able to own nuclear weapons. Because it just says the right to keep and bear arms. I mean, we could take it to a smaller degree and go to the New York example and say, I don't think New York has a constitutional right to restrict mace and non-lethal weaponry.
Right.
Because the Constitution says you have the right to keep and bear arms. If some neckbeard wants to walk down the street with an authentic katana, that shouldn't be illegal. That's an arm. In the same way that a gun is an arm. And it's even more incongruent that New York is sort of bound by the recognition of the Supreme Court that individuals can own guns. So they have to legally allow that. They put a bunch of hoops in place, but they have to legally allow that. But they can outlaw non-lethal weaponry. Isn't that really incongruent? You have to let your citizens acquire guns because it's constitutional, but you can ban all the non-lethal? Isn't a gun part of a larger set of weapons?
Right.
And it's more lethal. It's lethal. Guns are lethal. So it only makes sense that anything with less power than a gun would also be permissible under the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
So I don't understand that, but the Second Amendment doesn't have any caveats. It just says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Yeah, you could wheel a trebuchet down the road if you really wanted to.
Right.
That is protected under the Constitution. You'd probably go to the Supreme Court, all the way to the Supreme Court with that argument, but yeah, it's not listed out what they mean by arms.
Right.
It's not saying a rifle, like a musket rifle or a pistol or a 6-shooter or whatever, because they probably were like, we don't know what kind of weapons are going to be created in the future, so let's not make it specific.
Right.
Because it shouldn't matter.
And even then, back in their time, they had different classes of weapons. Like you mentioned, they had pistols and muskets and cannons. They could have said...
And trebuchets.
Right. They could have said the right of the people to keep and bear small arms or personal arms.
Right.
They could have put that caveat in there because that would have excluded cannons.
Right. But they didn't, because if the idea is that you have the right to form a militia against the state or federal government, if they have overstepped their boundaries, then you wouldn't put specifications on just personal weapons, because if you had a cannon or you could acquire a cannon, that would be instrumental in operating your militia effectively against the tyrannical government that you're trying to fight. So that they did it for a very specific reason. It was one, for self-defense, but also for the greater purpose of forming an effective militia if needed. So, of course, they're not going to caveat it within the amendment.
And to Tim Pool's point, he says he doesn't necessarily agree that people should be able to own nuclear arms. He just says you have to amend the Constitution if you want to outlaw it. But I don't know if that's true, because there is a recognition in United States law that rights can only go so far as you're not infringing on someone else's rights. So there's a classic example of a defendant in a criminal trial has a right to an impartial jury.
Right.
And people have a right to protest. So what happens when a jury can hear or see a protest? That has the potential to bias the jury. So now you have two rights, which are in conflict. And how do you resolve that? Well, you have to rank order them in terms of importance. And how you do that, I'm not exactly sure of the mechanism, but it has been decided as a matter of U.S. law that the right of a defendant to have an impartial trial is more important than the right of free speech. And so courthouses will enforce an order to move protests away from the courthouse. That is a minor infringement on speech, but it's in the service of protecting another right.
But in that example, we already have limits on free speech. Like, you can't yell fire in a crowded building.
Well, I think you can, but...
no, it's illegal.
No, it's legal. It's the intent that matters. If you're intending to cause a panic...
No, because you're inciting panic.
If that's the intent, though. If you say something that incites a panic and you didn't intend it, it can't be criminal.
Oh, like if you're mistaken, you thought there actually was a fire.
Or you could just shout fire with no intent to cause a panic, like maybe you thought it was funny, and you won't be criminally liable for that if it causes a panic.
But that's still a limit on free speech, though. I mean, I guess that goes to the point of intent, but what you're describing is also to the point of intent. Because if you're protesting outside of a courthouse during a major trial, the intent is to potentially bias the jury.
Right, but that intent is not criminal in and of itself. Right, so the intent to influence somebody is part of the normal political process.
That's true.
But if your intent, like with your words, is to incite violence, is to incite direct harm against somebody, that intent is criminal.
Right. So I guess the First Amendment is a little more blurry than the Second Amendment, just because of the rank order.
It's only blurry when two rights come into conflict. That's the point. So it's like when you have two rights, one right is going to consume the other right or invalidate the other right. Then you have to preserve both rights, basically. That's the goal, right? How do you preserve both rights? Because you can't just have people overriding the right of a defendant to a fair trial.
Well, is it an infringement then if the protest is just moved? It's not dispersed, it's just moved. So is that really an infringement? Because they're still allowed to protest, they just can't, because it is causing an infringement on the right to an impartial jury.
Yeah, I mean that.
So is that really an infringement or not?
It is a restriction of some sort.
Yeah, but only a temporary restriction.
Yeah.
Just within the process of moving them a few feet or yards away.
Yeah. But I guess that's my broader point about nuclear weapons is like it gets blurry. But I don't think you need to rewrite the Constitution to prohibit the use of nuclear weapons, because when you have a weapon that has an almost guaranteed chance of causing externalities, I think it makes sense to prohibit the use of that. So like you have a grenade or a bomb of some sort. It's hard to imagine a situation in which you can deploy that weapon in a defense situation without damaging or destroying unrelated private property,
right,
killing or hurting unrelated individuals, right? So it's like a gun is very precise. A knife is very precise. You know, you're not going to kill multiple people with that often unless you're intending to.
Right.
With a nuclear weapon, you might say, yeah, I killed my rapist with a nuclear weapon, but also leveled a city. So it's like, it's like...
And caused radiation poisoning and all kinds of stuff.
Right. So it's like, and the fallout that's caused. So, my point is that the deployment of a nuclear weapon or a grenade or a bomb has almost a guaranteed chance of causing an infringement on somebody else's right to property, right to life, and so can be restricted on those grounds.
Yes, but if we're going back to the cannon or trebuchet example, it should still be legal for you to own it. But if you deploy it in a citizen-to-citizen scenario, that would have severe consequences. But if you're using it in a scenario in which you've built a militia against the government, I don't see how that would be wrong.
Well, I guess it's more clear with a nuclear weapon because you can only hit the targets that you intend with a nuclear weapon, but the nuclear fallout can still blow all over the place and cause all kinds of damage, right? So it's my point is that if you have a weapon that's almost impossible to use without causing some sort of infringement on somebody else's right, then I think the government does have the ability to restrict the use of that weapon without modifying the Constitution. Do you see what I'm saying?
To restrict the use, right, but if the weapon is being used against the government, then that restriction is kind of void. So I guess it just depends on when the weapon is deployed, because if you're trying to fight a federal army or a state army as a militia, you'll probably use whatever you can.
Right, but even in that case, you're still going to cause externalities.
Well, of course, but you would with a cannon or a grenade.
Well, not necessarily, because a cannon can be aimed too. A cannon doesn't have the massive fallout that a nuclear weapon would, right? It causes more damage, but it is also precise. Like, you know where to aim the cannon.
Now, a thought I just had, how does arson play into like a militia scenario?
Arson, like using flame weapons?
Flame weapons, yeah, like Molotov cocktails or propane torches or, whatever. How does that play?
That's a good point.
Is that considered an arm?
Well,
in a militia scenario?
I would think yes.
And also, can you use a propane torch in self-defense on a single person?
I would think yes. I don't think if you're in an immediate self-defense situation and you just grab whatever's near you to use it as a weapon, yeah, it might be cruel to like torch somebody like in the face until they die. But that is an immediate threat to your life that you are resolving, right? Like it would be the same as if somebody picked up like a 2x4 and smacked somebody across the head. Like it's not explicitly a weapon, but you used it in self-defense. So it's not. And with the case of like a blowtorch or a propane torch or whatever, that's a very precise instrument as well. You're not likely to cause extra damage. With something like a Molotov cocktail, it's one of those things, again, where it's hard to see how you could use it in a manner that doesn't cause externalities.
Right.
And also, who would just have a Molotov cocktail like ready for a self-defense? Like you're going to carry around a full bottle. But it's like, it does go to the point. Like, does that constitute an arm? I think so, yes. And the Constitution doesn't have any caveats about that. So it's like, it should be used. Now, if you use a Molotov cocktail in a city, you have a high likelihood of damaging stores and other manner of other buildings that are unrelated to the situation that you're deploying it in. Right.
I'm just trying to think, from a leftist argument when all of these fiery but mostly peaceful protests were happening. You could probably use the 2A argument against leftists because of the Molotov cocktails, because if they're in support of burning down buildings and businesses and police stations and all of this stuff, then you can just throw back at them, well, then you're a supporter of 2A.
Yeah, that's
because
true.
They use Molotov cocktails and blowtorches and propane torches to set these buildings on fire and the cars on fire and things.
Yeah.
And then they'd be like, well,
Well, a lot of people make a distinction between leftists and liberals, where leftists are the types of revolutionaries that do agree with having weapons. Like the Black Panthers are leftist party, but they love guns, right?
Yeah.
I think Marx himself said, don't give up your guns, that the proletariat should have guns. So it's the revolutionaries that want the guns because they can use them as tools to enact the revolution. Yeah. And then the right likes guns because they are worried about the government being the revolution, the government being the thing. But then you have the left-wing liberals who don't care about rights that much, don't care about government overreach. They just want safety above all else. And so they don't really see a use either from a leftist perspective or a right-wing perspective of guns. They just want them gone because they cause damage.
Well, isn't that interesting that they want safety above all else, but then when you can use a weapon to diffuse a situation that would cause a lot of damage, they still scream gun control.
Yeah.
Because if someone walks into a church and one of the parishioners has a gun and neutralizes that threat before they even get a shot out, that's one life lost versus probably dozens. Mm-hmm. But they still cry gun control. I don't understand that. Like, they don't seem to be able to prioritize safety of the many over loss of life for the one.
Yeah, they don't view normal people having guns as safety, but it is, because normal people have absolutely no desire whatsoever to ever use their guns on somebody. Right. Never. But when you have people carrying guns out on the street, concealed, whatever, you essentially have a decentralized police force.
Right.
The shooting that happened in Texas, had, a teacher been armed, or had there been an armed security guard, in the school, that situation might have ended a lot quicker than it did.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like they don't think about guns as increasing safety, because you see these one-off events that happen with some regularity, and it's scary. But think about, there's more guns than people.
Yes.
So the amount of guns that are used in crime is astronomically small statistically.
Yeah.
So you have 400 million guns in this nation, and only, tens of thousands of guns are used in crimes every year?
Yeah.
Maybe 100,000 at most. 100,000 gun crimes a year out of 400 million guns. That's
and
like
not
a
all of them are
statistically...
lethal either.
Right.
Not all of the gun crimes end up with any casualties.
Like gun homicides are like in the tens of thousands every year. But
I don't even think it's the number one cause of homicide either.
No, I don't think so.
I think a lot of murder happens in a more personal manner, like smothering or strangling
or
stabbing or bludgeoning. Like it's something usually very personal. that results in a homicide. It's rare that it's guns that cause homicides. But again, you see these one-off things that are tragedies because it's mass casualties in a very short time frame. But of course, you wouldn't be able to do that with a knife. So if your goal is a mass casualty, you're going to pick something that is quicker.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think...
Which is unfortunate.
And to your point, like the evidence that the liberals aren't really that serious about gun control is they want to ban the rifles. But it's like only 600 or something murders are committed with rifles every year. And more people die from hands and feet every year than rifles.
Well, and they scream like, who needs a semi-automatic rifle? I'm sorry, but pistols are also semi-automatic. That most guns are. Even revolvers are.
They're not technically semi, but it's one trigger pull.
But they are, exactly. Because the way their mechanism functions, it's one pull, one bullet, one pull, one bullet, which is what semi-automatic weapons are. Yeah. It's very hard to get a fully automatic weapon in this country. Unless you are in the military and using it overseas. But it's a ridiculous argument to say you need to ban semi-automatic weapons because then you'd have to give up all of your handguns. Right. Probably even your revolvers, because they'd probably say, well, it is technically semi-automatic, even though it's not.
I mean, the only thing that revolvers have that would probably make liberals happy is that they have a fixed chamber size. They have a fixed amount of rounds they can fire. Right. You can't expand it with a new magazine. That's just not a thing. Yeah. But you can with like a Glock. And this is the problem that I have. It's like, I could understand if you're like, we need to get rid of all guns, because at least that is being consistent. But the idea that we just need to ban rifles, which is going to save 600 lives a year, according to the statistics, but might actually cost more lives because people don't have guns to defend themselves and their property. Right. But you eliminate, so you save 600 lives a year and eliminate those rifles. That's going to do nothing. That's like a drop in the bucket. It's like nothing. And furthermore, people like this mass shooter in Texas, you could just get a Glock with a 100-round drum mag. It's a pistol. Right. You got 100 rounds now. And
it's also still semi-automatic, by the way.
And in a school setting, a rifle isn't really giving you much benefit anyway. It's all close quarters, so it's like...
Yeah, you'd have the same amount of accuracy with a handgun in a situation like that than you would a rifle.
You literally have like a shooting fish in the barrel situation, which is tragic. But it's like, just because these mass shooters choose rifles, and I'm sure they choose the rifles because they want to look cool and militaristic. I'm sure they do that.
Oh, there's
but the rifle itself is not giving them any sort of additional lethality. Right. They could have easily walked in with a couple of Glocks and some 30-round mags and wreaked as much havoc as that. So it's just like
the talking point is always, no one needs an AR-15. No one needs a rifle that size. And it's like, shotguns are bigger, by the way.
Yeah, and more lethal.
And way more lethal, because if you put a slug in there, your entire center is going to disappear with one shot. Yeah. So even getting peppered with birdshot, it's going to cause a lot of damage because it's going to pepper you. So this idea that nobody needs a semi-automatic rifle is ridiculous because they might not be even as lethal as a shotgun, which is also a rifle. Because if you're as close as we are and I'm pointing a shotgun at you, I'm not going to miss. Right. And you're going to die. Right. So the idea that it's just these one rifles that need to be banned is ridiculous.
Yeah. And I think it's just emotional because those guns, they do look scary to somebody that hasn't handled guns before. Right. You know, they're all blacked out and they like got the magazines and they got optics. Well, and they got optics on them. And they do look like, they call it military style. They do look like that. They do have that aesthetic, but it doesn't make them any more or less lethal than any other gun. You know, you could have like a little Derringer, and if it's close enough, you know, a little 2-shot pistol, pull it out of your purse. If you're close enough, you're going to kill somebody. Right. I mean, that's just what guns are for, killing. Yes. That's what they're for. You hope to kill in self-defense or to hunt or whatever. Right. But they are instruments they are lethal instruments. That's what they're for. Right. That is their sole purpose.
That's the other talking point that really drives me nuts is, like our president said recently, you know, you don't need an AR-15 to hunt.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't think most hunters would take an AR-15
they
hunting.
probably wouldn't, but if it was the only thing you had on hand and you were hungry,
right.
you'd use an AR-15 to hunt.
Right.
But at the same time, he also didn't even say, like, no one needs an AR-15 for deer hunting. He's like, you don't need to get a squirrel with an AR-15. Well, no shit.
Right.
You could get a squirrel with a 22. Like, you don't need...
You could get a squirrel with a throwing stick.
Yeah, really, if you're good enough, you could just pierce it. But it's like, we're talking about apples and oranges here. If you're talking about hunting versus self-defense, they're not even in the same realm.
Yeah.
This idea that people just have guns to hunt is insane.
It's also just a historical non sequitur, because I read, about William Blackstone to start this conversation, and it's clear that hunting wasn't even in their minds. They were thinking about the right of self-defense individually, but also against the overreaches of the state.
Right.
That is where their mind was when they were ratifying this Bill of Rights. That was in their mind. That was the purpose. That was the genesis of this amendment. Is self-defense and the protection against tyranny. That's it. They didn't mention hunting at all, or at least not that's frequently cited. They may have mentioned it as like a secondary effect or as an additional reason, but it wasn't the primary reason. The primary reason was we need to enable the natural right of self-defense. And how do we do that? We guarantee the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Well, they probably didn't even think about the hunting thing because that was just something that you did.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because we don't hunt nowadays. Like hardly anyone hunts. But back in those days when you were settling the New World, there weren't no meat processing plants. Like it was just you go out, I'm sure there was agriculture for sure and domestication, but still hunting, especially in the winter, you need meat. You're not going to kill your dairy cows.
I mean, eventually I'm sure, slaughterhouses came to be once villages grew bigger, once towns grew bigger. But yeah, if you were bare bones in it, you needed a gun to hunt. And it was probably not even a thought in your mind when you said, yeah, we need to keep these guns to make sure nobody takes them. Basically, you were just like, well, yeah, of course I use my gun to hunt, but that's not the issue at hand. So it probably wasn't even part of the conversation. Yeah, realistically.
That's a good point. Yeah, that was... Yeah, that would have been a radical idea at the time too, because presumably most people had guns for the purpose of hunting. But then for them to introduce this new purpose for guns, or this to clarify this main purpose of weaponry, which is self-defense, that probably was a radical idea. Because I'm sure there was tons of guns over in the motherland in the UK, in the monarchy. Presumably, lots of peasants had guns.
Right. Well, it was probably almost offensive too, because somebody would have proposed this idea that you need to make sure that you have your guns and keep your guns in case the government oversteps their bounds. And I imagine people were clutching their pearls going, how could you say that about our government?
Right.
They treat us so well. Why would you even bring that up? But again, if they're radicals, they're going to think the worst of their government. And they were probably right to do so.
The correct position is to think the worst of your government.
That should be the default all the time. And I feel like we've entered into this era where we just trust our government so much, and we put a lot of stock into the government, and we also view them as being like these very philanthropic entities, but they're not. The government has never had your best interest in mind from day one.
Yep.
Unless you count the founding fathers, but I don't think they really consider themselves a government. They were just like, here's the rules.
Right.
Go play.
Right. Well, they didn't consider that. I mean, that was a big argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It was like, how much control should the federal government have? And they eventually ended up with a compromise, which ended up with the bicameral legislature, right? But I think the idea, as accepted by all of them, was that the states were going to be the primary seat of government power.
Right.
That the federal government was more just like to keep the union from dissolving.
Right.
And to facilitate foreign relations and to, raise an army. Like all of those things were duties of the federal government, whereas anything domestic would have been left to the states. And of course, now we have a total inversion of, not a total inversion, but the states are basically like non-entities, and the federal government's trying to do literally everything.
Well, I think you're starting to see a resurgency of state power, and a lot of states are going, I don't really care what the federal government says, this is how we're doing it. And they're really starting to take back powers, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and things like that. I think a lot of states are really itching to take back what is rightfully theirs as far as power goes.
Yeah. Cool. So should we talk about alphabet people?
we can talk about alphabet people. I want to preface this by saying, so this is an art gallery that is showing images of people, not real people, because this would never happen. But this is what happens when leftists or liberals or whoever is buying into this trans agenda and this radicalization of our children and this brainwashing of our children. This is what happens when they get so indoctrinated and they really want to push this idea. And they claim it's brave, it's beautiful, it's whatever. But anyone just looking at these images is going to go, that looks wrong. And that's how you know that it is wrong, because your biologic brain reaction, your biological neurological reaction is to go, this looks wrong. Yeah. This looks alien. It doesn't look natural. Because we can buy like men putting on makeup and dresses and you go, okay, that's just a man in a dress, whatever. Or women dressing like men and you just go, okay, that's whatever. But this combination that this artist has made, if you don't cringe, then your brain is broken.
Try not to cringe challenge.
Right. So
if you cringe, you lose.
So this was on modernmet.com or something like that, and it's called Hyper-Realistic Pencil Drawings Explore Gender by Depicting Female Heads on Male Bodies.
Oh boy, so should we pull up the first image?
We can pull up the first image.
Ew. So what are we looking at for people that might be just listening? So
we are looking at a picture of a very beautiful woman's face with long flowing hair, atop of a man's pudgy body.
Like a dad bod.
Hair from the pectoral muscles all the way down to presumably his groin, but it's covered up with a cloth, and very hairy legs. And she, whatever, is sitting on a beach, presumably, and posing in a very effeminate way.
And these are pencil drawings.
These are pencil drawings, yes. Okay. But even just looking at the stature, you can tell that the head is not made for this body. Mm-hmm. To be fair, it is hyper realistic. It is a very talented drawing.
Yes.
It's believable in that it does look as real as it can, and it is, as far as I can tell, proportional. However, because it's a woman's head on a man's body, it looks like she has a shrunken head.
Well, the other problem with this...
Because the shoulders are too broad for that tiny of a head.
The other problem with this is that the body has a lot of chub on it, but the face doesn't.
Yeah.
So that's making it look awkward, too, right. Despite the fact that it's obviously the wrong sex being portrayed. But also, it doesn't feel like it fits with the body because it doesn't have any extra fat, like around the neck or the...
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because this is the only one that is like fat, pudgy like this, but the rest of them still look odd.
So
like they still look
one?
disproportionate. Yeah, we can go to the next one. So here we see more hairy man legs with a very feminine, very pretty woman's face. But look how thick the neck is.
Yeah, that's weird.
The neck is not a woman's neck. And the legs are not a woman's legs.
Actually, I can appreciate this art because it's actually not because of the message the artist was trying to do, but because this actually reinforces the fact that we can tell what's different between men and women.
Exactly.
Like, by looking at this, I'm actually starting to realize what feminine features are missing from the body.
Exactly.
Besides the obvious ones. But like the collarbones are different, the shoulder, like, broadness or petiteness is like totally off. It's like
like muscle contours are different on arms and legs.
This is actually fascinating because it's having the exact opposite effect
exactly
on me. It's like, oh, this is actually accentuating the differences.
Well, and that's kind of how I reacted to it too, because whoever wrote this article said, this artist puts female heads on male bodies, which you bigot, but they said it's seamless. Like anywhere from the shoulders up is where that transition happens. But you can still tell where the transition is because we know what male features are and we know what female features are.
Right. And those aren't socially constructed either.
Right. And these, at least in these two that we've seen so far, these are not androgynous people. Like, okay, maybe there is a male that is of a slighter frame that you could put a woman's head on and it would look more natural. But there actually is an example of this and it still looks weird. But even then, it still looks weird, but this artist isn't doing that. She isn't taking more androgynous looking people and mashing them together. She's taking very clearly women and very clearly men and trying to put them together.
See, that would have been more effective for her message, is taking men and women that are androgynous and then doing a gallery of them. Because then you'd go in and be like, oh, wait, I actually can't tell which one's a man and a woman.
Right.
That would probably have been more effective for whatever gender nonsense she's trying to do than making the distinctions obvious.
Yeah, and so it made me cringe at first. Like, these two are pretty...
I skipped one.
Oh, that's okay. Like, these...
Here we go.
Next few, I guess, are pretty androgynous, but you can still tell...
Well, the hairy chest is a giveaway.
Well, the hairy chest, but the one on the right, it seems like it's a more boyish body in a younger face.
The definition on whatever these shoulder muscles are called and down into the forearm.
Right. The deltoids into the bicep.
Yeah, that's very, like, it's a very masculine shape.
Yes, and even, like you said, it's the collarbones, too. Because, yeah, you can look at the chest and go, okay, there's no breasts there, so obviously it's not a woman's body. But even without that, like, let's just say she didn't have breasts, her collarbone would still be more delicate. Her collarbone would still be narrower and slighter and probably actually lower down, because I think men have higher collarbones than women do and shorter necks, generally speaking. So you can still tell that this is not a woman's body.
Yeah, even like the tendons here where the neck is meets the chest or the torso. Even the tendons and how they flex out and how they move are different on women. Right. Like, they just look more delicate, more fine, more smooth.
Well, I think she's erased the Adam's apples on purpose.
Oh, I see.
But even without the Adam's apple, you can still, like, that's a thick neck. That is not a woman's neck. It's so interesting how this makes it so easy, like you said, to tell the differences. Because you look at it and just go, this is not computing in my brain. It's not seamless. The pencil markings themselves may be seamless, but in your brain, you can actually parse out which features are a man's and which features are a woman's. It's insane how good our brain is at doing this.
Right.
Which is why we don't buy it when men dress up like women and put on all of their makeup and their dresses and get breast implants and all of this stuff. You're like, I can still tell that you're a man. It's not convincing.
Right.
Even if we want to play along, it is not convincing. And the same when women chop their breasts off and mutilate their bodies and cut their hair short and try to talk with a deep voice, you can still tell that that's a woman.
Well, that's
it's
a good
not
point.
Convincing.
Like, we can usually tell almost all the time just based on the physical features, no matter how you're dressed up or how much makeup you have or how long your hair is. You can usually tell. But then you add in other pieces of data like how your voice sounds, and you can tell when a voice is just not natural and they're trying to make it more feminine or more masculine. You can tell. Like, we've all heard, like, I think last week we did the video of the trans person, the teacher, and like the voice sounded like they were on helium or coming off helium. It's like, you can tell that that's not a natural voice. And that in itself is another tell that these people are just, they're not what they want to be. I'm sorry. That's just how it works. You're not what you want to be.
They cry, you've misgendered me. But again, even if you are trying to look like the sex that you are not, our brains are so good at parsing out what is a woman and what is a man that we are not going to be convinced at a biologic level. If you tell us that you're a man, please respect my pronouns. Societally, we might go along with that. It depends on which society you live in, which culture you live in, but we can still tell that you are not who you say you are, which is why we, quote, misgender you. Because we're actually just gendering you properly, even in spite of your efforts to make yourself look different.
Yep.
We are so good at this. We are very good at recognizing human shape and human faces. It's inherent in us, but it also if I had to take a gander, is probably because it has survival implications, knowing what is a woman and what is a man, biologically speaking, especially if you're a small child.
Yeah.
If you're a small child and you're trying to survive and your parents have been killed, you're probably going to try to find the nearest woman to take care of you.
Yeah.
Because that's the last nurturing thing that you remember as a very small child.
Yep.
So I'm sure there is some kind of biologic implication for that. But I think there's one more picture, or is this the last one?
There's a couple more pictures.
Okay. Let's just look at them because it is fascinating, but...
Yeah, we can just go through them pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So this is another example. Obviously, the very broad chest and shoulders are dead giveaway. The shoulder bones are a lot more like, they just look thicker.
The thick necks.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's that the necks are thicker, it's that they are more muscular.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of saying, like the tendons and like everything feels like tighter and stronger.
Right.
I don't know. Okay, so there's this one. Yeah, again, you can tell by the arm. Like, that's a man's arm.
Right.
You know? And even,
and the hands, too. I mean...
The one on the left, the black woman's face and the black man's body, like, the shoulders are so bumpy. Like, they're just so muscular.
Yes.
It doesn't look androgynous at all. Like, if you cut the head off of that picture on the left, and you just gave that bottom section to somebody and said, is this a man or a woman's body?
Well, you can almost see like the exact spot where it happens because of the neck tendons.
Right.
You can tell that she's combined their two necks, but I think it probably would have been more effective if she had just used one neck.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
It's
not to say that women can't have definition in their shoulder muscles, but it's not that.
Right. It's like men, if you're not overweight as a man, that definition is naturally going to be there. You can make it more defined by working out, but as long as you're not overweight, that definition is going to be there for an average man.
Right.
Like, that's it.
Right.
And that is just physiology.
Yeah.
There's no getting around that. And then this is the last image here.
Yeah. So I guess the black woman on the right is probably the most convincing one out of all of them. Because I feel like the man's body was a little bit more androgynous, and she has very strong bone structure in her face.
Right.
But you can still tell. It still doesn't look
right. Yeah, and the problem is she's turned like 3/4 or whatever.
Yeah, so you can't tell the broadness.
Yeah, if you were going head on, you'd be able to see, oh wait, those shoulders are massive.
Right.
But because this fictional person is, situated in a way that's more slimming, and again, the fact that the neck is like split halfway up the neck, so like you lose the tendons.
Tell. Yeah.
And the fact that there's a tank top on this one, so that's kind of covering up a lot of the anatomy.
Yeah, right. So that one's probably the most believable, but it's still, you can still tell.
Yep,
you look at it immediately and go, that's just wrong. So then this was just the little clip that they said from the article. American artist Cleo Newton explores gender and femininity in her series of hyper-realistic charcoal drawings called Venus. It's interesting that she's exploring femininity and not just gender and identity in general. I mean, I guess she kind of did this in a way because, like we said, we can clearly tell the women from the man parts on these images, but inspired by the art of Renaissance masters like Michelangelo and Botticelli, she depicts an array of young subjects with female heads and male bodies. This seamless transition is intended to speak to the gender fluidity of this era.
You know what I just thought of that's kind of ironic? So she did the gender fluidity in a very ham-fisted way. Like we said, they're not androgynous. You can tell which part's the woman and which part's the man. The ironic part is that people still debate about the Mona Lisa, whether it's a man or a woman.
Oh.
And this was done like, in the 1400s or whatever.
Yeah.
Or no, I think 1400s.
Yeah.
I could be wrong on the exact date, but in the Renaissance era, Da Vinci, Mona Lisa, there's a debate about whether that's a woman or a man. So in some sense, that art from hundreds of years ago, from the actual Renaissance, done without any of this gender fluidity, is actually more androgynous and more sort of useful for the gender fluidity conversation than
well,
this
and even
one.
if you look at like painted images from Michelangelo of like fat naked ladies, if it's a fat naked lady with her back turned,
You're
just
like,
because
is that a
she
man?
has long hair,
Yeah.
because she's pudgy and her face is round and everything, you're like, man, woman?
Right.
So they were more successful at being androgynous during the Renaissance than I think at any point in history since or prior.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because I think that was a big staple of the Renaissance, was like blurring of all of these lines, because it was a reinvention of society and culture and art and all of these things. And so men dressed like women and women dressed like men. And the idea was to just kind of look like a homogenous group of people.
Yeah.
And they did that a lot in their artwork. But if that was what she was trying to do, she kind of failed.
Yeah, like it's like the art was great in terms of the technical skill.
Right.
But it was ham-fisted in terms of its messaging. Like
Right.
you're basically, it's like if you cut off a photo of a woman's head and I cut off a photo of a man's head and stitched them together in Photoshop and then like blurred the lines. That's what it looked like. So it was like, okay, yeah, you went out through all this effort to do these pencil drawings, but at the end of the day, you just created something that's sort of like not really that special.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the skill is special, but your execution is like not really anything special.
The cultural point that you're trying to make missed the mark.
Right.
I think there was a lot of ways she could have done that.
Yeah.
If she was trying to support gender fluidity.
If you wanted to do gender fluidity, then make the differences between men and women not as obvious as you made them.
Now, if she wanted to say men and women have very obvious differences and here's why, you'd look at that and go, wow, that's really powerful. I can see that for sure now. Because when it's all on the same person, maybe you're like, I don't know, I guess they pass as a man or I guess they pass as a woman. But when you try to combine the two, you go, oh, no, that's wrong.
Yep.
I can tell the difference. So if she had been a right-wing artist and that was what she was trying to convey, it would have been successful 100%.
Oh, and she would have been blacklisted,
Oh,
transphobic.
sure. And then she would have went to work for the Daily Wire.
It is kind of really funny, though, how she almost made the exact opposite point she was trying to make.
Yeah.
That is very funny.
Yeah.
And I guess in that sense, you could say that it's good art because people can look at it and come away with different conclusions.
Well, in the future, if you're looking at that, you go, what was the point of this art? You know, if it might become a debate later. Like, what was the purpose of this gallery or this series? And looking back at this era of gender obsession that we're in, it's going to become one of those staple art pieces, I think, of the era.
Yeah.
That really illustrates that obsession. So
Cool. All right. Should we move on to
Yes.
this next one here?
So this one I just kind of found in passing. The website is not really important because it originally came from Reddit, but it was on the thread, the Am I an Asshole thread.
Yeah.
So it's basically where people explain a situation where maybe they said something wrong or they, not wrong, but they had an interaction and they're going, was I the asshole for how I acted within that interaction? So this headline reads, quote, I haven't been able to sleep since then, end quote. Neighbors claim dad's brainwashing his 5-year-old daughter by encouraging her wish to be a housewife.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go to this.
So AITA for encouraging my daughter to be a housewife.
Am I the asshole?
Right.
Yeah.
My daughter is at the stage where kids pretend they are grown-ups with jobs.
Are these Reddit comments?
This has hit the original poster's
Okay.
Reddit.
Okay.
The jobs differ depending on who she meets or sees in the TV. In the last few months, she wanted to be a teacher, babysitter, truck driver, president, garbage collector, photographer, quote, knee doctor after I injured it, scientist, witch, football
I'm
steward.
sorry. Wait. Witch is not a profession. I'm sorry.
It's a way of being. Well, neither is knee doctor, to be fair.
There's no knee doctors?
I think they're just bone doctors.
Oh, well,
Joint
anyway.
doctors. Anyway, I don't think the knee has its own profession specifically, but and a football steward, which this is in England, so they mean soccer.
Yeah.
And then it says, last month I was watching a football match with her, and she asked me why are the people in yellow not watching the game. When I explained they are there to ensure that no one go to the pitch, she told me that's what she wants to do when she grows up because they get paid to do nothing. LOL. Smart 5-year-old.
Classic kid comment.
I try to play along with every job she wants to do and buy her the required tools for it if I could afford it. For the steward job, I got her a little vest and made her an official badge. She would stand in silence watching me, and after a few minutes demand I pay her. Last Saturday, an old friend of mine paid us a visit. My daughter asked her about her job. My friend replied that she is a housewife, so for the whole afternoon, my daughter kept interrogating her. After my friend left, all my daughter wants to do since then is to be a housewife. She already has 3 kids that she helps with homework and teach them manners, and one of them has a food allergy. Kids have very active imaginations. It's just cute. She's 5, by the way.
That's so funny that she would just invent food allergies for her imaginary children. Like
this one's allergic to peanuts, and this one can't have milk. Or whatever.
That's so funny.
Isn't that cute?
Oh, if I was her dad, I'd be laughing nonstop.
Well, I imagine that the friend said like, oh, my kids have allergies or whatever. And so now she's like, my 3 kids all have food allergies. It's just cute. Anyway, so yesterday we were coming back from the grocery store when we met some neighbors. With a U-R. Ugh. They started talking with her when she told them she just came back from the grocery store to make dinner for her husband and children. They gave me some weird looks and said goodbye. A few hours later, they knocked on my door. They wanted to have a private discussion with me. After I explained what's happening, they gave me a 1-hour lecture about how stupid and ignorant I was, and I should stop encouraging this because I was damaging my daughter. They told me we aren't in the 60s anymore, and young girls shouldn't dream about being housewives anymore, and demanded I stop brainwashing my daughter because her subconscious will start settling for being a housewife instead of dreaming about bigger things.
First of all, why is this guy letting them lecture him for an hour?
Right.
After they said 5 words, I'd be like, we're done. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Like, why are you giving them a platform, number one?
Well, that was kind of my point. It's like, why is Western society so
self-loathing?
Not self-loathing, but why have we made it okay to make other people's lives our business? Like, who are you? You're the neighbors. Mm-hmm. Why is it any of your business how he's raising his daughter if he's not abusing her? Of course, they'll probably claim that this is abuse.
That might be why he gave them an hour of his time, because he didn't want the situation to be misportrayed as if he was doing abuse
calling,
or something.
Like Child Protective Services or whatever. I mean, that could be. But again, there's no evidence of that, because how do you prove psychological abuse anyway?
Right.
And also, it's not the neighbor's business. And he isn't telling her she has to do these things. She asked his friend about it and then decided that that was interesting enough to play pretend as it. These neighbors, they're so entitled. They feel like they can tell you what to do. Again, this is England, so if this happened in America, I don't think it would happen in America.
Right.
But why are your neighbors putting themselves into your family situation?
Right.
It's none of their business.
Also, this is just like normal young girl behavior. Like, this is why dolls exist.
Yeah.
So they can pretend to have children to take care of. Like, that's what young girls do.
Right.
They play house, they have dolls.
Listen, we had guns and Legos, and we had dolls and a play kitchen. I always gravitated to the dolls and play kitchen because that's just natural tendencies.
And I made guns out of Legos.
Right. And use plastic swords and whatever. But it's like, girls have a natural tendency for caregiving and being caretakers. A kitchen and baby dolls just represents that want to do. When you have all of the toys available to you and you still pick the pink kitchen, that's just what you want to do. And he said that he's given her the opportunity to explore all of these other things. And if we're going to play the sexist game here, she played pretend as a teacher. That is primarily a female field. You're not going to say that's sexist and damaging, that all she wants to do is be a teacher? It doesn't make any
Well,
sense.
it shows like a perversion of goals in life too, because they say, oh, well, she should be dreaming of bigger things. It's like, what, raising a family is not a big thing?
Yeah.
Taking care of the home and taking care of your children and raising them and educating them so they can become big, strong adults. That's not meaningful? That's not a big thing?
There is literally no other job on the planet that requires your attention 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 365 days a year, except being a parent, being a homemaker. That is the only job. Because every other job, even if you work 80 hours a week, when you're done for the day or the week, you're done for the day or the week. It doesn't carry on.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're a parent, your child could be throwing up in the middle of the night and you have to go to work. In a manner of speaking, right? Because it's your job and your want to take care of that child who is sick.
Mm-hmm.
It is the biggest job that you could do.
Right. And this is, I mean, isn't this kind of the point of like, so these people that confronted him, they obviously have a different value system, right? But they're being bigoted in the fact that they are taking it upon themselves to try to impose their value system on somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Like the entire point of having a tolerant society is that you don't have to have people imposing their value systems on you.
Mm-hmm.
You can pick the value system that works best for you and your community, and that's the value system that you do, and you recognize the right of everyone else to do that. That's the only way to have a successful, like, multicultural society, is to just respect that you can do what you want and respect that other people can do what they want. But these people are so progressive that they are literally becoming bigoted,
right?
Because any other value system that is antithetical to the progressive worldview has to be shut down and eliminated. And so it's like, I don't know how you share, like, I know this is UK, but how do you share a country with people who don't want to leave you alone, who want to impose their worldview on you forcibly? You can't, right? I mean, most families want to do, or, a lot of women want to do, they just want to be left alone. They want to raise their family. They want to have a good life. You don't need people coming and knocking on your door telling you, you have to do this, you have to do that, this is wrong. Like, you can't have a society that lasts that long because, at least in the United States, if the progressives keep pushing their worldview down our throats, you're going to get an equal and greater uprising from the right. The right wing is going to start imposing our worldview on you forcibly. And this is going to come first as a banning of abortion, which I support. But in many ways, they brought this upon themselves by being staunch advocates of abortion. They could have just left the issue alone, let the states do their thing, and it wouldn't have blown up to the degree that it is. But they couldn't leave it alone. They wanted legal abortions everywhere at all times.
Right.
And so now the right wing is rightfully saying, you know what? We're done playing defense. We're done trying to get these little victories on abortion. We're going to outright outlaw it in the states where we can do it.
Right.
And you got constitutional carry is the same thing. We're sick of gun control, so we're going to make gun control impossible in our state.
Right.
Like, this is going to, and the right wing is going to win, because I think the right wing inherently has the spiritual, I guess you could say, makeup that makes them ultimate victors.
Right.
Like, the right wing are comprised of people who are industrious. They won't take losing as an answer. They will stop at nothing until they've won. I don't think you see that same sort of tenacity from the left wing. I think they're more sneaky. I think they're more like, they infiltrate and they do things in the shadows. But when the right wing catches on to that, they're going to impose their
I don't know
word.
if it's that they don't have a want to win. I think it is just that they try to be sneaky about it. Like, they aren't as honest about their intentions. But they definitely don't like losing, because you see that every time a blue-haired freak starts shrieking. They don't like losing, and they're also very good about playing as a team. So even if they disagree amongst their team, they still band together to get things done. The right is not as good about doing that.
Right. I guess my point is that they've only been winning because they've been running unopposed. I think that when push comes to shove, when the right wing realizes, as we are, that we're in a battle, a spiritual battle, a political battle, whatever, and we realize that there's only one winner, the right wing's going to win.
Right.
Because I think that determination to win above anything exists more on the right wing as a trait than the left wing.
The other problem that with this post that is really telling about our Western culture and our lack of knowledge of history is that they said that neighbors said that well, we don't live in the 1960s anymore, and this is going to damage your daughter subconsciously. Everyone in the Western world, for whatever reason, thinks that anybody who lived in the 40s, 50s, and 60s who wasn't a white man had a horrible life and was abused relentlessly and all of these things. It's like, that's not true. These women who are housewives in the 60s were married to men that they loved and were in very long, healthy marriages until they died. And they enjoyed being at home and taking care of their children and doing these things. It wasn't like a prison sentence for them. They weren't abused. Their husbands never raised a hand at them. But for whatever reason, that's the trope, is if you were a 1950s or 60s housewife, you were beaten relentlessly.
Right.
And your life was horrible. And it's like, I have never met a married couple who's been married for 50 years that are like, oh, he's been abusing me my entire adult life. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen.
Right.
That doesn't happen. Probably because he'd end up dead before they went into a divorce. But this idea that that's just how society was in the, post-war era is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it's misinformed. So we have to stop using that as an excuse. Caricature. Yeah, we have to stop using that as an excuse.
Yeah.
Cut the stigma on housewives, man.
Yeah, it's like...
It's so ridiculous.
Well, it's so weird. Like, the progressives are all about, don't unfairly stigmatize and stereotype, and then they stigmatize and stereotype anything that they don't like. It's like, you guys are so inconsistent.
They just like talking about out of both sides of their mouth. That's all.
Ridiculous. All right.
Yeah.
Last story. Here we go.
Oh, this one's about the alphabet people again. This is from the Post Millennial. Can you get that?
Oh, dang it. Get the ad out.
Out of here. This says Virginia school librarian describes students as sex workers. And
Hooray.
I will give everyone one guess as to which school district it is.
Fairfax? Is that what it's called? Fairfax? Or
no.
Loudoun County.
Loudoun County. Yep.
Loudoun.
Loudoun.
I don't know. Loudoun. I don't live in that backwoods
Virginia. It's Loudoun County because they haven't had enough controversy in their school district at all. So
well, it's all the DC pedophiles moving out into Virginia.
Yep.
Ew.
This school district has a lot of problems, and if you live in Loudoun County and your children go to school in Loudoun County, please pull them out of that school. Are we
sure there isn't just like a portal to hell in DC and the demons just keep crawling out?
Well, there might be. That's probably why they want to make it its own state. It's just one big pit that everything comes up out of.
The school teachers are climbing out of the pits of hell and going right into the school system.
Right. I wouldn't be surprised. Oh, man. Anyway, so this reads, a concerned middle school teacher in Loudoun County, Virginia, couldn't let the comments of fellow school employee Stephanie Guido slide after reportedly hearing her say some students, the majority of which are 11 to 13 years old, could be considered, quote, sex workers. Guido, a librarian at Sterling Middle School, made the statement while defending a library book which said sex work is just like any other job, comparable to a store clerk, an architect, or a journalist. As sex workers, students could benefit from the book's placement on library shelves, Guido said. And of course, we know sex work is not like any other job because you are commodifying the human body for money.
You're commodifying the human body. It's a vapid experience. You're not using your creative abilities in any capacity.
It's immoral.
Right. It'd be like...
it's dangerous.
Yeah, it's just like you're using your body for its base functionality. You're not... The entire purpose of large tracts of moral thinking is that you have your animalistic tendencies which need to be tended to, right? You need to eat food, and food can be pleasurable to eat, right?
Sure.
But that can't be your only existence. If all you do is eat, number one, you're gluttonous, you're going to be fat and unhealthy. But number two, you're not utilizing your efforts to do anything more meaningful. In other words, you're neglecting the rational and creative side of human nature. And that's basically the source of a lot of moral issues, is to neglect that, I guess you could call it a higher calling, to neglect that the capacity to be selfless, care for others, be industrious, be creative, to think deeply about things, to promulgate new ideas in the world, all that stuff. You're neglecting all of that when you're engaged engaging your time in baser animalistic things. So that's basically what you said. Like, sex work is a commodification of the body, but it's also you are neglecting the exact faculties that make humans unique from animals.
Right.
You're making your money based on your body, and that's it.
Right.
And that's inherently going to be unfulfilling, because I just think it's natural for people to feel more fulfilled when they are engaging their higher sense of rationality and creativity.
Right.
You know, if I got paid to just sit and do nothing, I'd be a mess. I'd be a wreck. I'd be so bored out of my mind. I'd be unhappy. But it's like, in some sense, you're like, well, why wouldn't you be happy just collecting a paycheck and doing nothing? You don't have to work. You don't have to exert any effort. Why couldn't you just sit on the couch for 8 hours a day, collect a paycheck, and be done? Why wouldn't you be happy? It's because we are called to engage our higher faculties. And when we don't do that, we don't have fulfilling lives.
Right.
And so that's another problem with sex work. It's not just the immorality, the commodification. It's that you're not engaging that higher purpose.
Right. So then this is about the book. I guess it's not, but the content of the book was enough to shock the teacher, but what alarmed her more was Guido's assertion the book should remain in the school library because it could be useful to students. As sex workers, Guido postured, the book would help them feel validated and less alienated. Again, these are 11 to 13-year-olds. So I don't know what this Guido knows and why she's saying that these 11 to 13-year-olds are sex workers.
Yeah.
It sounds like maybe she's paid them herself.
There's two ways to approach it. One, she knows something that she shouldn't know.
Right.
And that students are being abused.
Right.
Or she has such a wacky view of progressive ideology that she just assumes that some of the kids are sex workers. So one thing is she's just so deep in the ideology that she not only thinks that it's not a problem for 11 to 13-year-olds to be sex workers, but she assumes that some of them are.
That's so weird.
Or that she has direct knowledge of that.
I mean, it's a weird thing to even think about 11 to 13-year-olds having a job at all, because we have laws against child labor in this country.
Yeah.
So if anything, you shouldn't be thinking about your students having jobs until they're at least 14 in some places. So to think of any middle schooler having a job, let alone one that's sex work, is like, do you know anything about how our society runs?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing if you're like, oh, I'm 12 and I cut my uncle's grass for $10 or whatever. That's not really it's a job, but not really.
It's more like a chore.
It is more like a chore. It's just, whatever. But
it's
this says Loudoun County Police could not be reached for a comment on what action, if any, is being taken in the investigation of Guido. According to statements made by Deputy Jamie Holben to the Daily Wire, there's concern that children in the school may be exposed to sex trafficking efforts in the neighboring region.
So this also made me think of something else. So when we were kids, obviously we got taught, like, if a stranger's going to approach you about anything, really, you have to be extremely cautious. And if they ask you to do something, you say no, you run away, whatever. You don't go with any strangers that your parents haven't communicated in advance that you're going to go with, whatever.
Right.
And so the idea sort of was put in our mind that when strangers are making requests of you, you should automatically just not trust them. Right. It's one thing to interact politely with strangers, like in a normal way. But when they start making requests or whatever, that's when you got to worry.
Right.
This is... So let's say there's no sex workers in this middle school, which I hope there isn't. But having a book that normalizes the idea of sex work is doing the exact opposite of what we were taught.
Right.
If you think sex work is normal, especially at the age of 11 to 13, and some creepy ass dude, propositions you, I don't know if you're going to have that same instinct. If you've been conditioned to think that sex work is normalized, and then somebody asks you for some sort of sexual interaction, are you going to have that repulsion that we were taught to have? Or are you going to say, well, my school library said sex work was normal, so maybe I'll just make some money?
Yeah.
That's kind of creepy, isn't it?
It's super creepy. And also, if there is any sex trafficking going on and this librarian knows about it, she's required by law to report it. Educators actually at least in our state, anyone who is employed by the state is a mandatory reporter. Even if it's like you work for the Department of Transportation on the highways or whatever. If you hear about something that's happening with a coworker or whatever, you are required by law to mandate that abuse or whatever it is.
To mandate the abuse.
Or to mandate the reporting of. You are mandated to report the abuse.
Yeah.
So I worked for the state when I was in college because I worked for the university and that it was a state subsidized school and we were mandatory reporters. So if anyone expressed that they wanted to kill themselves or whatever, you had to report it. So the fact that this person is just like, oh yeah, there's sex workers, whatever, they should be fired just on the grounds that they failed to report anything that they heard that was suspicious.
If they heard something, yeah.
If they heard something.
Yeah.
Or they could just be out of their minds. But
yep.
The book is titled, quote, Seeing Gender, an Illustrated Guide to Identity and Expression, end quote. The book defends sex work as a respectable and upstanding career choice in a chapter titled, quote, Sex work is not a bad term, end quote.
It boggles my mind how often these leftists routinely get reality exactly wrong. Like, they're not just wrong because they have a wrong assumption or whatever.
Yeah.
They are literally advocating for the opposite of everything you should be doing.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you doing? And this is why they cut themselves. This is why they fill themselves up with tattoos and get endless piercings and dye their hair blue, is because they're trying to find meaning in vapid things.
Yep.
And they're not going to find it. The only meaning to be had is from the right-wing perspective.
It's like they've taken all morals and just flipped the coin over, and all immorality is now their moral compass. And
right. And you can understand it because
understand.
it's hard to realize why restrictions, let's say moral restrictions, are necessary. You see them, especially when you're younger, as an artificial barrier. Like, this is kind of a stupid rule. Why should I follow that? Why can't I have sex with whoever I want? I'm going to go do that. But they're finding out through their quote-unquote lived experience that when you disregard all these traditional moral rules, you're actually going to be just a depressed and anxious mess who's looking for meaning in all the wrong places. These moral rules exist for a reason, and discarding them is how you destroy yourself.
Right.
And if everyone discards them, that's how you destroy society.
Well, they're doing all of these things to find meaning, and then when they are depressed and anxious, like you said, they find Band-Aid fixes instead of reflecting on their choices and reflecting on why moral barriers exist.
Right.
They just go, well, maybe it's just me, so let me take this medication and maybe I'll feel better. Like, everything that they do is superficial. They just go, oh, there's something wrong with me. They don't ever go, maybe I did something to make myself feel this way. And maybe there's a way to get out of it by confronting those internal demons and confronting those regrets and fixing it, or fixing it as best as you can. They just go, well, my brain's broken, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, so let me pop these pills every day.
I'm neurodivergent.
That just means you have autism.
Yeah. Well,
Or you're gay and autistic, which I don't think can occur in the same
I think you're
place.
being exclusionary by saying neurodivergent is only autism. You got BPD, you got anxiety disorders.
Oh, is that what we're calling mental illness now?
They're neurodivergent, yeah. Neurodivergent is inclusive because it can also include people that have a self-diagnosis or feel different.
So everybody?
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's like all these people are claiming these mental illnesses, but they've never been to a psychologist, never been to a psychiatrist. And the actual occurrence of these mental disorders is far lower than what all these self-diagnosed hippies are claiming. But again, the mental illness, the claim to mental illness just gives you a leg up on the victimhood ladder. So that's the only reason that people are self-diagnosing or creating mental illnesses in themselves. It's bizarre.
Completely self-destructive.
This is like following the crowd and giving into peer pressure to the complete extreme logical end. It's like if one blue-haired leftist did jump off a cliff, everyone else would be trying to find higher cliffs to jump off of just to be like, look, I jumped off of a higher cliff. I'm a bigger victim.
Right.
It's like, I don't understand.
Oh, you're
Why
a
can't you
transphobe.
just be an independent person? Why can't you just be an independent thinker? Why do you need to have approval from large swaths of people all the time?
Yeah, I think it is because they're just trying to find meaning. The only meaning they have is with their group, and they don't want to do anything to isolate themselves from that group. So as the herd starts moving one way, you don't want to be the straggler. You want to be going with them. So you're not your primary. I think their primary motivation is to stay with the group at all costs.
Yeah.
They don't want to be an outsider because then that would basically be the destruction of their identity, which is a total straw man identity. But nevertheless, so all it takes is for one crazy person or a small group of crazy people to promulgate a new idea that's even crazier, and they start moving that direction, and everyone else goes, all right, well, I guess we have to go with, because they don't want to be the stragglers.
Right.
And so it's like, I think it's just a weaponization or a parasitization of the natural human desire to be a part of a tribe, part of an identity. But they're misplacing it. They're taking it to an extreme, and it's just leading them all astray.
This all ties into our conversation about the cult that is plaguing our society and the infantilization of our young adults. Because of the obvious peer pressure. Like, if you're an adult, you probably should not be giving into peer pressure. Yeah, you're an adult. Yeah. So if you are, you've been infantilized and you didn't ever grow up.
That's a good point.
Because you still care about what other people think.
That's a good point, yeah. So, you don't think of, I just want to highlight that point, because any respectable adult that you can conjure up in your mind, that you look up to, that you admire, those are the people that are not going to go along with the crowd.
Right.
And that's exactly the kind of person you want to be. You want to be able to stand on your own merits.
Right.
So that's a good point.
So this vapid existence ties into that. There was a third thing that I was going to say that I know we've talked about before, but I can't remember. But I mean,
you can
see, right. Well, you can see how not wanting to be left behind just ties into all of these things that are happening simultaneously. It's the infantilization. It's getting sucked into the cult, and it's the lack of spiritual guidance, which is probably a result of joining the cult. But it's all of these things compounded to create these sick adults that don't know how to self-regulate. They don't know how to be independent. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, this ties into our conversation about how no one has hobbies anymore.
Yeah.
If you had a hobby, you are probably more inclined to be an independent thinker. Because by nature of having a hobby, you kind of have to be, because it's a solo endeavor. Even like any hobby is a solo endeavor, pretty much. I mean, you can share hobbies with people, but you can't do them together literally. Like, even like riding a bike, running, it's still, you have to do it. It's not anyone else can do it.
And it goes to my point, a lot of hobbies do require the exercise of that higher purpose.
Right, exactly.
So your job may be unfulfilling, but if you have a hobby that requires you to think and to plan and to be creative, that's going to sustain you. You know,
right.
I mean, in some sense, I know what I'm going to do every day at my job, but after my work day is over, then the whole world opens up and I can work on any number of projects. You know, I could learn how to play a song on my guitar, which takes a lot of effort, or I can build a new app for myself, like whatever. So I think people need hobbies. People need to leave the cult. They need to figure out they need to demonstrate to themselves ultimately that they can be useful and they can have ideas and they can think on their own. Yeah. And that when they do those things, good things happen. That's what they need to, you need to demonstrate that to yourself.
Well, my least favorite thing I hear from like people our age especially is like, man, I wish I knew how to do this thing, or I wish I could do that, or I wish, like, oh, that's such a cool hobby. I wish I could do that. And I'm like, why can't you? You think I just woke up one day and could do this? No, it took years of teaching, self-teaching, taking lessons if necessary, and honing a skill and practicing over and over and over again. It's not just going to come to you naturally. Like, I'm sorry you didn't have a parent or an adult in your life when you were younger to teach you from a younger age, because now that you're an adult, it's like, oh my gosh, it's going to take forever.
Right.
When you're a kid, you just do it and you don't even think about it.
Right. And kids learn quicker too.
I bucket the idea of starting a new hobby too, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm getting into. It's going to take a long time to get good at it. But if it's something that you really, truly want to try, no one is stopping you from picking it up and trying, or reading on a forum on the internet about it, or just starting. Like, stop saying you wish you could. You can.
Right.
You're an adult, presumably with a job. Go spend your money on supplies for said hobby. It's not that hard.
Well, I wonder if people are overwhelmed too, because I'm finding the biggest struggle I have in my life, honestly, is managing my time, because I have a lot of interests and there's a lot of things that I want to do, but then there's only so much time in the day and I have to work. And so I'm thinking I basically have to make sacrifices. I have to choose which thing I want to learn or do is more important, and everything else has to be sidelined. And so if you don't have a skill already, I could see how it'd be hard for somebody to just pick one and go for it.
Right.
Because it's a choice paralysis. You know, you have a finite amount of time and a dozen different things that you'd ideally like to learn. I think it's more likely that, given that scenario, somebody just does nothing rather than dive into something. And you have to get over that.
Yeah, I mean, you do, and you do have to prioritize, but prioritization comes with adulthood. Like, you have to make sacrifices and decide what is more important and how you're going to spend your time when you have it. But also, if there's, to anyone who doesn't have a hobby, if there's one thing that you keep consistently going back to, where you're saying that would be so fun to do, or you're constantly watching videos on YouTube of somebody doing it, that's obviously the one thing that you want to try. So instead of feeling like you can't do it just because somebody else is better at it than you, of course, there's always going to be somebody better than you. That's just how life is. Just do the one thing that you're so interested in. Stop watching other people do it and do it yourself. Yep. Now, if you suffer from choice paralysis, like me and Jacob, I can't help you. You have to prioritize that yourself.
You just have to bite the bullet.
Just pick, I don't know, spin a wheel, pick one. If you can't do it on your own, pull it out of a hat. Maybe one week you try something and then the next week you try another thing.
You know, scope out, like watch YouTube videos of people actually doing the thing that you want to do and see which one looks the most interesting to you.
Right.
If you're interested in coding, watch somebody. You don't have to understand what they're doing, but watch them do it. You know, if somebody's knitting, watch them knit. Just figure out, because you can often find just by watching people because you can imagine yourself in that situation and then you can sort of project how you would feel being able to do that.
Right.
So that might be helpful too. But yeah, you do have to pick. You can't just let choice, because I think a lot of people, they get choice paralysis and they just default to the easy thing, which is boot up Netflix and eat some ice cream. And it's like, you can do that, but you're never going to start a hobby and the time is only slipping away.
Next time you try to pick up your phone to scroll, put it down and go do something productive.
Yes.
Just pick something. Good
message. Cool. All right. I think that's it.
Yeah.
All right. So this has been Take Your Medicine. Once again, I'm Jacob.
And I'm Sadie.
And make sure to make sure to check out all of the links in the description below. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching.